I want to tell you a story that'll change the way you see even the kindest neighbors. It's about me, my son Junior, and Mrs. Benson, our sweet, kind, too good to be true neighbor. This story still gives me chills. Mrs. Benson lived right next door. She was the kind of woman everyone trusted. Widowed, no kids of her own, always smiling, always ready to help. Need sugar? She's got it. Ran out of gas? She'll lend you her cylinder. She'd even babysit Junior when I had to work late or run errands. I thought God himself had sent her to lighten my load. Junior adored her. He'd come home from her place talking about the snacks she gave him and the stories she told. Mommy, Mrs. Benson said I'm her favorite, he'd say, grinning ear to ear. And honestly, I was relieved. Having someone like her in my corner, a blessing. Or so I thought. It started small, little things I brushed off as coincidences. One day, Junior came home with a beaded bracelet. Mrs. Benson gave it to me, he said. She said it's for good luck. I remember looking at it, feeling a weird pang in my chest, but I waved it off. She was just being sweet, right? Then came the songs. He'd hum this unfamiliar tune under his breath, low, creepy, almost like a chant. I asked him where he learned it. Mrs. Benson taught me, he said, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. Still, I ignored it. After all, she'd been so kind to us. Why would I suspect anything? But then Junior started changing. At first, it was subtle. He'd get angry over small things that never used to bother him. One night, I asked him to do his homework, and he threw the book across the room. Junior, I snapped. What's gotten into you? He just stared at me, his eyes dark and distant. You don't understand, Mommy, he said. Mrs. Benson says you're holding me back. That stopped me cold. Holding him back from what? Things got worse. He'd sneak out of the house at night, and I'd find him sitting in the garden, staring at Mrs. Benson's house. When I'd ask him what he was doing, he'd shrug and say, I like it there. It feels safe. What was going on? The turning point came one night when Junior woke up screaming. I rushed into his room and found him curled up in the corner, shaking. It's here, he whispered. What's here? I asked, my heart pounded. The shadow, he said, pointing to the corner of the room. I looked, but there was nothing there. Yet the air felt heavy, cold, like someone or something was watching us. Mrs. Benson said it's my friend, he muttered, clutching the beaded bracelet. That was it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, I marched over to Mrs. Benson's house. What have you been telling my son? I demanded. She smiled sweetly, too sweetly. Oh, dear, I've only been helping him. He's a special boy, you know. Her words sent chills down my spine. Helping him by teaching him chants and giving him charms. She laughed, a low, unsettling laugh. You wouldn't understand. Some blessings come with a price. But don't worry, I'll take good care of him. I grabbed Junior and left, but her words echoed in my mind. The price. What price? Desperate, I took Junior to our church and begged the pastor for help. As we prayed, Junior started to scream, thrashing around like he was being held down. Then he whispered something that made my blood run cold. She said, you tried to stop me, he said, his voice not his own. But it's too late. I'm hers now. The pastor didn't stop praying, and as he did, Junior collapsed unconscious. After what felt like hours, he woke up crying. Mommy, he said, I'm scared. That's when he told me everything. Mrs. Benson had been initiating him into something dark. She'd promised him power, freedom, and things no child should ever have to think about. We decided to confront her one last time, with the pastor by our side. When we got to her house, she was waiting for us, standing in the doorway like she knew we were coming. Her smile was gone, replaced by a cold, menacing glare. You shouldn't have brought him here, she said, her voice low and sharp. The pastor began to pray, and Mrs. Benson changed. Her body seemed to shrink, her skin pale, her eyes dark as night. The air around her grew thick, almost suffocating. As the prayers grew louder, she let out an ear-piercing scream and collapsed. When she looked up, she was herself again, but broken, weak. You have no idea what I've been through, she whispered. I didn't want this life, but I had no choice. Don't make bargains with what you don't understand. And just like that, she disappeared. Her house was empty the next day, like she'd never existed. That night, as I held Junior close, I realized something. Shortcuts and easy blessings come with a price. Mrs. Benson had made a bargain with darkness, and it had cost her everything. I promised myself I'd never look for quick fixes, no matter how tempting. God's timing might feel slow, but it's always right. Did you enjoy this story? If you want to hear more like this, drop a comment below and say more. I'd love to share more stories that'll keep you hooked and leave you with something to think about.